Let's talk about the biggest meal planning mistake I've been making and see if you're making it too. Hi, this is Anne from Nan Loves Food, and today we're going to talk about my biggest meal planning mistake. So this episode is definitely inspired by a podcast that I was listening to. It's from Kendra Adachi over at The Lazy Genius Way. If you are not following her, she is absolutely brilliant. I will link the specific podcast below, but also just check out her stuff in general because smart lady. So I actually first listened to this podcast a while ago, and it's kind of been rattling around in my brain ever since. And I think some awesome points were made, but I have some additional thoughts to add to the conversation. So for me, the biggest mistake that I've been making around dinner is making assumptions about what dinner means and what it has to mean. So I grew up in a family where my father is a meat and potatoes kind of guy. If there is not a big slab of meat on his plate, like animal protein, he is not happy. It is not a full meal for him. Growing up, I had this assumption that every meal has to have a big slab of meat on the plate, which is obviously not true. I certainly enjoy my fair share of tofu and beans and things that are not animal protein that provide plenty of protein. But in my head, for it to be a proper dinner, it has to include that big hunk of meat. Also in my family, my mother has always been of the belief, especially because I was born in the 80s, in the world of carbs are awesome, which I miss those days. You too? Just me? That every meal had to have a starch on the plate. So for me, dinner in my head has always been a very clear formula of starch, vegetable, and a big slab of animal protein. And as I've grown into adulthood, as I've entered a place where dinner is my responsibility, I've started to challenge those assumptions about what a proper dinner looks like. Another mistake to that end is assuming that because what I think constitutes dinner is what my partner constitutes as dinner. It's completely unfair for me to make assumptions about what my partner thinks is an appropriate dinner versus just like asking him. And it turns out that the assumptions that I had about what I thought he wanted, he doesn't actually care about. So I had these ideas about what I thought he wanted. I had these ideas about what I thought was okay, what was right for dinner. And I think the more we can do to unwind these expectations, especially these artificial ones that aren't even real, the easier dinner time can be. So my hope with this video is to inspire you to ask the questions that maybe you haven't asked before about what dinner done right looks like, because it's different for every person. And so having those conversations with your spouse, your partner, your kids even, asking them what they think constitutes dinner, I think could be really helpful. So I put together a list of questions that you can use kind of as inspiration, and also feel free to throw in your own. The first question is, what needs to be a part of a meal for dinner to feel like dinner? So like I said, growing up, there were kind of three elements for me and my family. There was the starch, the animal protein, and the veg. And I know some people also really require the fourth element of a dessert, some sort of sweet ending to the meal. And I totally get that. Like, there are certain times when my meal does not feel complete until I've had something sweet. Some days that's as simple as grabbing a couple of little chocolates, and some days it's more complicated, like, no, I really need some chocolate cake or something. How many of those four elements really need to be a part of a meal for it to feel like a satisfying dinner to you? And this is based on feeling. There is not a right answer here that's gonna work for everybody. I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you are the person in your family who plans and cooks and prepares the majority of the meals. So this just has to be what works for you. I also have a list of things that I have very specific feelings on that might help you talk through some of these points as well. So whether or not soup counts as dinner. Now, for me, soup can be different things. A cold soup, like a gazpacho, that does not count for me as dinner. But a big steaming bowl of chili, heck yeah, that's dinner. So there are different nuances to this conversation. And like a pureed soup, like a tomato soup or a carrot soup or something like that, That also has different requirements for me. So there's kind of a lot to talk about in each category. But like, does a big stew fit the bill? And if you are gonna do something like a big stew, does there have to be a side? For me, nutritionally, all of the requirements of a meal are met in that stew, but it feels incomplete to me without like a big slab of buttery bread. Or with my tomato soup, I always want a grilled cheese, right? So there are just some things that we associate with these foods. A big steaming bowl of tomato soup and a grilled cheese is absolutely a complete meal to me. It may or may not feel that way for you. That might feel like a lunch or something that doesn't count as dinner. So where does soup fall for you? For me, gazpacho is an appetizer at best. I am never gonna enjoy a cold soup and feel like, you know what, dinner done. But I do know that there are people who feel that way, that like gazpacho is a totally fine entree, or some other cold soup. Hot sandwiches and cold sandwiches, for me, hit differently when it comes to dinner time. So a good Italian sub, I love. Give me all of the salami and the pepperoncinis and the vinegar and the oil and the provolone, like all of those things are so delicious together, but for me that is absolutely not dinner. It doesn't qualify, even though it has all the right elements. A cold sandwich for me doesn't fit the bill, but a French dip, because it's warm, does. So think about what meets the bill for you, what meets the bill for your family, and ask them what they think. Another thing about that is side dishes. For me, for dinner, a potato chip is not a side dish. I don't know why, it just doesn't feel like it counts. So, but a French fry does. So there are just certain side dishes even that can influence whether or not a dinner feels like a dinner. And I would also like to qualify and say that some days throwing together a cold cut turkey sandwich and opening a bag of potato chips is the best I've got in me for dinner. And so it will work, right? We don't need to put pressure on ourselves unduly. But in a perfect world, what counts and what doesn't? Another question is salads. So does the big entree salad count? And if it does count, does it require an animal protein? Does it require a bean or a lentil or something to give it some protein and some substance? Or are you totally fine just to have like the big garden salad for dinner? Does that work for you? Again, there's not a right answer here. It's just what works for you and your family. I know that if I served my husband a big garden salad for dinner, he would be like, where's the rest of my food? So, you know, we're all allowed to have these preferences, right? Another one that we absolutely love in our house and don't do nearly often enough is breakfast for dinner. So the traditional American breakfast where we do, you know, eggs and bacon and maybe some pancakes or some biscuits and gravy, does that count for dinner for you? Growing up, this was not something we did for dinner very often. And when we did, it was like such a treat. Because obviously through the week, nobody's got time for that, like the full American breakfast. So sometimes just taking that dinner evening time preparation and having a blowout breakfast for dinner, especially with a good Belgian waffle. Yeah, that totally works for dinner for me. I totally get if it doesn't do that for you. Well, I hope that list of questions was helpful, and I hope that if you're making the biggest dinner mistake that I was making, which is making assumptions about what right looks like for my own household, I think it's easy to forget that like we're grown-ups who get to make these decisions, even though I'm really, really a grown-up. Sometimes reevaluating the assumptions that we have about ourselves and our lives can be really, really beneficial, because we can put ourselves into these boxes that either our parents put us in, or society puts us in, or somebody told us this was right, and we get to work that stuff out for our own families. We don't have to listen to somebody else's idea. I hope this video gives you permission to maybe step outside of what your right dinner box looks like and expand and hopefully make some easier options that are going to satisfy you and your family. And I hope that we can use these questions to be kind to ourselves and to give ourselves grace in a time of life and a season that we could all use a little more grace. So that's all I have for today. I hope you found that video helpful. If there are any assumptions you have about dinner that I missed, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. So please go ahead and do that. And while you're at it, give this video a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching today. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.